Please join me in welcoming Binodh for this next talk.
Okay. Hope people are not that tired. Let's see. The best we can make out of this talk. Okay. So it's a software delivery platform. I just wanted to sort of all of us we write code, right? After writing the code, what all are the different things that actually makes up a software that's actually running in production? Can we just try and recollect what that is, right? So we come to the desk, have the laptop, wrote the code, right? And once the code is written, you're actually going to commit it, create a PR, right? There you are actually going to hit the first software because you actually need to commit the code to some code repository, right? And after it is actually committed, the PR is approved. What happens, right? It goes to a CI pipeline, a continuous integration pipeline. What does it do? The continuous integration pipeline means that it's actually going to first build the software, right? Once it is built, it need to be tested with several things, right? So that means we already have hit two softwares. One is the code repository, the continuous integration software. Now, okay, you tested the software, and after that, what happens? It produces an artifact, some sort of an artifact, or no more artifacts. So what do you do with the artifact? So you now need an artifact registry, right? Need to be pushed to a registry. So that's the third software. Now, then what do you do, right? You need to make sure that, okay, the software that is produced and pushed to this repository is actually good and fine, right? Did it actually pull in, some vulnerability from some software and so on. So that means you know, you need to scan it, right? You need to scan the software, the code. You need to scan the artifact itself. So there you hit another one, right? So, and then what happens? Then you actually deploy the software. So, okay, so a continuous deployment software that you're actually going to hit, right? And then what happens? After you deploy the software, what happens is you need to verify that whatever you deployed is fine, right? Okay, did it break things? Do you want to actually use your eyes to figure it out, or right? You need a software. So you need a verification software. Okay. Now, then what happens? Right? You need to obviously, we talked about cell-based deployment in the morning. So you need to orchestrate the release of the software. Right? Okay. So that's and so the point is that I can go on and on and on. Right? The point is that software delivery means after you write the code, how do you get to production, right? Without any problems. So software delivery platform is an integrated management plane that orchestrates entire everything after code, right? So now that means that I have a very tough task here. If I cover all these softwares, right, it's actually going to take quite a bit of time. So I'm actually going to concentrate a few things which actually what are central to the software delivery, right? So so the Harness, which is a software delivery platform that we are actually going to talk about, um, it began in 2017 as a startup. So we are actually going to look at a few things that I'm just hoping that this talk will bring out. One is how a system is built and it actually evolves over time, especially in the startup world. Nothing is created with everything together. So where do you start and how you evolve, right? And in the process, how do you take decisions on different things on the software? And also we are all developers, so how do you actually deliver software after you build? So so let's say look at the beginning, right? So the first thing, the Harness started as a continuous delivery platform, which actually means that, like, how do you deploy continuous deployment platform? So the first thing is deployment need to be close to the customer's infrastructure. So the first architectural decision Harness took was actually like, let's put a delegate, which is actually like a software service, which is very small software service, put it inside the customer's infrastructure, which can actually deploy the software. So that's where it started. So that's the first piece of architecture that was created. So this is like the first version I'm talking about. In the first version, every startup need to be simple, right? Like, you need to actually get it as simple as possible. You need to get the conceptual model correct, but at the same time, get the fundamental concepts correct, right? Like, how do you actually get it right? So the initial sort of capabilities in the harness, we call manager delegate pattern. That's a pattern that is used in harness, which is essentially a manager in the cloud sort of uses the delegate to do the deployment. All right. So, and the only thing that actually the first version supported was the deployment and verification. So essentially, you have a UI through which you can actually operate the software delivery platform, and that's all, right? You have like a database which actually holds it. The things which started with this is like, on pipeline. And you can see that, like, end of the day, the software deployment or the delivery is actually a pipeline. So that's one important part. So let's look at like manager delegate pattern a little bit more, detail, right? Like, so it might like look too simple. As the company grew, we started actually adding more capabilities. So now, if you look at the delegate actually look like this, right? Like, because you have a corporate, network, which actually obviously fronted by a firewall, it is protected, etc., etc. Now, which means you have a number of different things in the delivery platform, which the delegate now need to talk to. So you can actually start with artifact repositories, cloud providers, orchestration, runtime, verification, notification, all of that, right? Like, so that's a core part of how the delegate actually communicates, right? And all of this need to actually happen in a very secure way. So that's why you have this piece of software which is actually running in the customer's premises. And then it obviously connects to the cloud, which is what we call app.harness. You can just think about it as a SaaS, another SaaS software, and user browser communicates with this. So this gives a little bit more sort of detail on, the manager delegate pattern that we were talking about, right? Now, the key things about this, the number one, it's firewall friendly, means that like there is no access from the cloud to the delegate because you're actually putting the software inside the customer's premise, which means that like you obviously can't, have like, your software actually going and mucking around with that. The path is only the other way. Um, it's a scalable architecture because you can add as many things that you want on the delivery platform on the other side. And if you can see the proxy setup, right? Like, SSL is actually like just set up at 443, it just communicates on that HTTP. Now let's look at as company grew, it got a little bit more interesting. So let's look at this, right? Like, so in this case, you can see that, like, let's say, like, let's look at another part of the software delivery, like in a continuous integration. Now, the continuous integration is obviously something that you want to build, but you don't want to always spend, your customers infrastructure for that. You obviously, like, there are customers who actually want to just start with like using an available infrastructure to actually do the the build and test and creating the artifactory, right? Like artifacts, right? So which actually means that you need a hosted infrastructure as well, right? Like, so this hosted infrastructure is actually like one of the fastest build infrastructure that the delivery platform has. So that's, again, more about, what happens in the cloud. So you can see that like the tiny software that we created in 2017, now started growing. We added more capabilities, right? The continuous delivery and the continuous integration has come up. And all of this again is accessed through uh, the browser, through the cloud software that we have. Okay, so then what's in the cloud, right? That's the next thing. Um, so before we get into that, let's look at the key concepts that we have looked at it so far. Whenever you build a platform, a service, a new capabilities, the main thing is about creating the concepts right. So if you get the concepts right, you are actually creating a system which is actually can live for longer. It's not going to die off in a few months. So that's very critical. So what are the concepts that Harness got right to start with, right? The first, service, environment, and infrastructure. These three are very critical to where the service delivery is happening or the software delivery is happening. I'm sure I don't have to explain what that is. It's very self-explanatory what it is. Second, everything is driven by a pipeline. So what step is your software delivery at and on what stage it is actually very important. The third is how do you organize your SaaS software, because it's a B2B software. It's not like, let's say Flipkart or, PhonePe or any other B2C software is, because it's used by other companies and other businesses. So you need a way to organize the users who access the system, which you have like a three-layered sort of organization. It's very important that you get it right. And that actually, like for Harness, it's account, organization, and project, right? Like, so that's the way. So essentially, you have a service which is inside a project, which is inside an organization, which a tenant has an account for. And that's basically what we are actually running through this software delivery pipeline. All right, with me so far? Good. So now let's look at how everything after code that we talked about comes together, right? Like these are the two things which I said I am going to talk about. The main thing is actually about what's a pipeline, which actually brings all of this together. So, okay, sorry, that's a glitch. How does a pipeline execute, right? So this is like a view of pipeline, it's a very simplified view of the pipeline, which actually executes a software delivery. So you can see that like there's a pipeline service in the center, which actually shows, right? Like this one is basically where it's going to start. So you can see if the first one, let's say like it's actually doing a deployment, the simplest thing is actually like it's going to start with a Kubernetes deployment where the pipeline picked up that execution request, right? So pipeline is actually going to resolve and queue that execution request. And then the next step is actually like from the queue, you need to find the right service to operate on that. So that operation is, so as I said, like this is where, different modules in the system come to play. So there can be many different services, many different capabilities in a delivery platform, and one of them picked it up. In this case, it is CD, right, which is continuous deployment, because the deployment step. Okay, and now it need to find the right delegate to execute that. All right. So now, like I said, we have a system where a service, a subsystem which actually manages all the delegate communication. And that's the one which actually going to know everything about delegate. Nobody else know anything. So it actually means that you are going to take the request and pass it to that system to actually take care of it. All right. Now, the delegate acquires a task, and execute the request. The response is streamed back. The response come back, and the pipeline is getting executed. So, and once this execution finishes, it goes on to actually execute the next step. All right. Now, all this is streamed back to the UI through the the log service. So one natural question that we may have at this point is that seems very simple, right? Like, you have a step, it actually went through a few different steps, like execution stages, and it got executed. Why is it a big deal, right? And why can't you just take one of the existing services, like, I know, a ton of workflow engines in the market, pick one of them and that can run it. Why not, right? I know we had like a few build versus buy discussions we had today from the morning. So this is another one, right? Like, so um, the key thing is, when a capability in your system is core to the business of the company, that's where you actually innovate. That's where you want the best system to be in place. That's where you actually want the best performance, best scalability, and best, you know, um, cost management, right? Um, so price to performance has to be like really, really high. So here, the scale demands, you might actually think that like it's very, so I know that like workflow engines in the market can actually execute like really high scale. But the difference here is that, we should actually understand which market we are actually like, going with this, right? So the scale demands are actually on a per workflow basis. That actually means, sorry, for the steps in the workflow basis, how many steps execute within a workflow? So there are, if you take an example, let's say you have a software component, like, an application that runs in uh, an operating system, and that may have, how many versions, right? Even iPhone application itself, like you probably have like, n number of versions. And now compare on the other side, like, it's a communication software. On the other side, you'll have like 20 other things, right? Like, so you have a combination, that's actually just keep increasing. So the point is that, like, there are customers who actually take releases once in a day, which actually means that one workflow which actually takes all the software and build it, which actually is like a significant explosion. What we are seeing is it's going from thousands to millions. And that's where like we thought that, like, okay, this is a place where we should actually innovate and, create our own software. And that's the reason we created our own workflow. Now let's look at like, and I need to go a little faster perhaps to manage the time, but let's zoom out on what this SaaS software look like, right? So if you look at the downside of the system, there are several platform capabilities. It's not surprising. I mean, you can see that like platform capabilities exist everywhere. So you can see pipeline services, access control, log service, notification, a number of the services, which is actually working as the platform for the software delivery services. And then you can actually see that like the system on top, each one actually is a software service itself, right? And on top of that, there's a view. So it's like if you unpack it now on the original system, you actually have a huge software SaaS, which has several services. Each are actually a part in software delivery uh, pipeline, right? And now they're all essentially fronted through a gateway. I know we had a talk on cell-based architecture. That's exactly what happens here. So if you look at the cells in harness deployment, it would look like something like this. So on a GCP, and you have cells. Like one interesting thing about this is that, like, applicability of the cell-based deployment. On a B2C system, you could probably design a system where, maybe even without cell, you can scale. Right? But on a B2B software, it's very natural to have cells. The reason is like there are different classes of customers. There are different SLAs which you can actually offer. So that's where you actually have cells for certain set of customers. So for example, at least in Harness case, the way we actually organized it is like, freemium has, SL. Large customers have a cell. For dog fooding, we have a different cell, and so on. So that's another way of, handling the cell. And obviously the front part is the same as cell-based architecture. discussion that we had. So I'm not going to go deep into that. Okay. So now let's fast forward to 2026, right? Where we are. So from 2017, when we started building the system, if you remember that tiny architecture that we had, it grew to 18 products. Okay. So it looks somewhat like this, right? There's a reason I'm showing this slide now. Um, so you can see the number of things that are actually part of. I'm not going to read it out. Now, please take a look at the slide, right? Um, the number of things which are actually making the software delivery platform. And each year we are adding more and more, right? And that's the beauty of this. Now then, so if you look at like from a systemic perspective, it looks something like this. You need a significantly good infrastructure layer. You need shared services layer. You need like a lot of shared services because you now have 18 products that are running, right? That's where it is. We call it modules. It's a very, very simple name, but it's each one of them is actually a system of its own, right? So now then there's a natural question, okay? Is pipeline the only thing that is holding it together? No. So I know, we are all in the AI world, you know, how do you make sure that we have a unified context graph that actually is available for people to consume, right? So the first thing which Harness did is, I think last year, is create a unified data platform. This unified data platform is actually the central system for creating a data fabric. It's completely based on a semantic layer, which actually means that you define the types and entities and relationships in the system, and then put the data inside that, which means that all the entities that's coming from 18 different products. We have a startup in a startup culture, which actually means that they're all grown very fast. But now you have an opportunity to actually like look at each entity, define its semantics, define its type, and put the relationship between and put that in a single place, right? And with the experimentation that we have done with the AI agent, we found that using an SQL to actually like retrieve the data from such a complex graph is actually not going to be efficient and correct without hallucination, which means that we created a language to actually access this graph. So the language looks like this. It's very similar to SQL, but as a slight trick there, basically a way to cleanly split down the SQL using pipes. So that's an innovation that we have done, which actually makes it easy for an LLM to understand the context, build the query. That's basically the thing. We actually got like about 30% more accuracy with this mechanism. Otherwise, the syntax and the constructs look very similar to this. It's also another thing is it's a graph, so it's not like just pure data. So you have a way to sort of traverse the graph if you want. So you can actually add for initial data traversal primitives in a very different way. So what does this knowledge graph now contains, right? Like, this knowledge graph now contains, your own personal context because you're actually obviously operating on an AI agent. Obviously, the harness provides an agent too. Have organizational context. You have the platform and the best practices. And all of this actually is in the knowledge graph, not just the harness data, but also the data from outside. So the delivery platform now has all the data from potentially all the tools that are out there. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide specifically because it's a very standard slide, right? The point which I'm actually trying to make is that like with the the knowledge graph and the context that actually it is establishing, now it powers the AI agent architecture because all the AI agent architecture roughly would look similar in my head. Like I've seen like a number of them. But the key part is how do you build the context? right? Without having the right data, without having the right relationship between the data, your context graph is actually not going to be useful, and your AI agent can only do the as much work as it can based on the context that is made available to it. So I'm going to actually leave it with this picture, which shows AI agent in action. You can see that the AI agent which is actually working is actually going to have the right side panel. It's actually just asking, the user is asking to create a delivery pipeline. It's actually able to create that pipeline using that context which is available in the graph. So that's where it is. There's two key parts which actually gets the delivery platform together. One is the pipeline. The second is the data fabric that is powering the platform. So that's the final slide. I can take questions. From question there.
Guys, we have some time for questions, so please shoot.
Yeah, hi. So from dev completion to go to market, there are multiple areas which needs to be tested, right? Security, vulnerability, compliance, performance, load, stress, etc. So is it possible to generate these test cases? Because that is one pain point that organizations have, is to write these test cases. And then for the pipeline to run, uh, you need to have a environment where these test cases needs to be, where this application needs to be deployed and the test cases needs to be run. And the more test cases you add, the slower it will make the pipeline, right? Because there are a number of tests. So how can this platform help in managing all these areas, pain point areas which organizations have?
Yeah, so I mean take one by one. Right? The first question was about making sure that the security is maintained. So the tool set in the software delivery platform contains the software scanners, which actually is compliant with for example, checking with OWASP the top 10 issues from a web application perspective. So the scanners are there. There is also a security test orchestrator which is part of the platform. What that orchestrator, because each company has their own compliance rules on what you need to actually test or not test. So which actually means that you have an orchestrator which actually orchestrates different scanners, which actually comes put the test together. So that's another important thing. And then he actually asked about performance and reliability testing. So there is a testing system which is called chaos testing. Obviously, it's basically based on litmus chaos. If people have used litmus chaos, so it's basically turned into a service which actually the delivery platform can use to actually inject faults into the system, and that actually will create a delivery testing. And one of the problem with so if you look at software chaos testing is that not every organization is ready for testing essentially chaos testing in production, because their operational maturity is not there. Because if you actually just have a system which actually just fire faults into that with only 20 customers, maybe tomorrow you won't have those 20 customers. So which actually means that naturally you need to have a testing environment for testing it, and that's also provided as part of the resiliency testing module, which is actually part of the system. And the VM pool that we have in the Harness cloud infrastructure is again part of the software delivery platform, which gives you the place to actually run them. So that's the way it is actually organized. So if that answers the question.
Thank you so much.